The street was quiet when he walked into town. The sun was low. The wind pushed dry dust along the ground like a dirty blanket. Men stopped talking when they saw him. They did not know his name yet, but they could feel something about him. He moved like a man who was ready for trouble and tired of it at the same time. His name was Dan Tucker. In time, they would give him another name. They would call him Dangerous Dan. But on that first day, he was only a stranger with sharp eyes and a worn hat, coming into Silver City with nothing special to show except the way he watched every doorway and every hand. He had been born far away, in cold country, where winters were long and the land was thick with trees and snow. Canada was a different world from this burning desert. No one in Silver City cared about his boyhood. They cared about whether he could ride, shoot, and stand his ground. They cared about whether he was scared of dying. That was how men were judged in the West. Don did not talk about his past. He kept his words short and his stories locked up. Some men said he had killed a man with a knife in Colorado. Some said he ran from the law before he ever wore a badge. No one could prove it. Still, the rumors stayed close to him like dust on his boots. People watched him out of the corners of their eyes and whispered that this quiet man had a hard edge inside. The town he walked into was not safe. Silver City was full of miners, drifters, gamblers, and men who liked to drink until they forgot their own names. Money moved fast, and so did guns. A man could live here for 10 years and then die in 10 seconds because he looked at someone the wrong way. The law was thin, like an old rope ready to snap. Sheriff Harvey Whitehill knew that rope very well. He carried the weight of the whole county on his shoulders, and he needed men he could trust, men who would not turn and run when bullets started to fly. When he met Dan Tucker, he saw something he liked. Don was not loud and he did not brag. He listened more than he spoke. His eyes were calm, and his hands were steady. Before long, Sheriff Whitehill pinned a badge on Dan Tucker's chest and made him a deputy. Some men in town nodded with respect. Others frowned and muttered that the sheriff was putting a gun in the hand of a man who might enjoy using it too much. Don did not argue with or comfort anyone. He simply took the badge, checked his weapon, and went to work. The first time the town saw what kind of man he was. Music was playing and people were laughing. It happened inside Johnny Ward's dance hall. The air was hot and smoky. Men danced with women in bright dresses. Glass broke. Boots stamped the floor. A small fight began, the kind that usually ended with a bloody nose and a good laugh. But this one did not stay small. Two men started shouting in Spanish near the bar. One pushed. The other pulled a knife. Steel flashed in the lamplight. In a blink, the blade sank into flesh. A man cried out and grabbed his side. Blood soaked his shirt. The attacker saw the shock in the room, cursed, and ran for the door with the knife still in his hand. Someone shouted for the law. People pushed back against the walls, afraid they might be next. The wounded man fell to his knees, gasping. Outside, boots hit the street. The attacker stumbled into the open air, heart beating fast, eyes wild. He thought he had one chance to escape into the dark. Don Tucker was already there. He had moved quickly when he heard the call. He stepped into the street with the badge pinned to his vest and his revolver ready. He saw the bleeding man inside. He saw the knife in the fleeing man's hand. There was no speech, no request to drop the weapon. Witnesses later said Dan did not waste a single word. He raised his gun, took aim and fired once. The bullet hit the man in the neck. He dropped hard to the dirt, the knife slipping from his fingers. For a moment, everything was very quiet. Music stopped. Conversation died. Men and women stared from the doorway of the dance hall. Sheriff Whitehill's young son was among the witnesses that night. He never forgot the sight of the stranger with the badge standing over the body, face still and cold as stone. To some, it seemed like justice. A man had stabbed another in a crowded room. He had run with a weapon in his hand. A lawman had stopped him. A clean line from crime to punishment. To others, the speed of the shot was something different. It was a warning that the new deputy might be as dangerous as any outlaw. The town did not have long to think before another test came one day. A drunk man began throwing rocks in the street. It did not sound serious, but in a hard town, even a small thing could grow teeth. The drunk aimed at windows, at signs, even at people who walked too near. Children ran inside. Owners closed their doors. One stone hit a man on the shoulder. Another smashed a window and scattered glass on the floor again. Someone called for the law. Again, Dan Tucker answered. He walked toward the man without hurry. Dust lifted around his boots. People watched from behind curtains and cracked doors. The drunk turned to him, still clutching a stone, still shouting. This time there was no knife, no blood yet, only a wild man with bad aim and worse judgment. Some low men might have tried to talk him down. Some might have rushed him and tried to wrestle him to the ground. Dan chose another way. Witnesses later said he did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He drew his gun, pointed it at the man, and fired at the drunk, dropped to the ground, and did not get up again. There was no trial, no judge, no long report with careful words. The killing was written off as part of the harsh life of a harsh town. It added another layer to Dan Tucker's growing name. People started to say it with a mix of fear and respect. Dangerous Dan. Silver City grew quieter in some ways. Men who used to wave guns when they were drunk now put them away when they heard his boots on the boardwalk. Outlaws thought twice before causing trouble in a town where the deputy did not hesitate. Mothers might still worry when their children went out to play, but they knew there was one man in town who would not step back from a fight at the same time. A cold thought moved through the minds of many. If Don Tucker could kill so quickly for a knife and a rock, what else might cause him to pull the trigger? Where was the line in his mind? How far would a man like that go in the name of law and order? Dan did not answer those questions. He woke, worked, and slept like any other man. He checked his gun, kept his eyes open, and walked the same streets day after day. But people watched him more closely now. They measured their words around him. The town began to change around the quiet deputy with the deadly hands. In a world where a man's life could end between one breath and the next, Dan Tucker had proved two things. He was not afraid to act, and when he acted, someone often died. That was the beginning of his legend. The story of Dangerous Dan had started, and Silver City would never be the same again. Silver City did not forget what happened in Johnny Ward's dance hall or on that dusty street where a drunk man fell with a stone still in his hand. People whispered about it for days, then weeks. The story grew larger every time it was told. Some said Dan Tucker could shoot faster than any man they had ever seen. Others swore he did not even aim, that his bullets simply found the men who needed stopping. No one knew the truth, and Dan never explained it. He was the kind of man who let silence tell most of his story. Sheriff Harvey Whitehill watched everything. He was a man who had seen many gunfighters come and go. Some were brave, some were foolish, and some were only lucky until their luck ran out. Dan Tucker was not like the others. He did not drink much, he did not gamble much, he did not start fights, and he did not look for praise. He did his duty with a coldness that made other deputies uneasy. Whitehill knew that a man like Tucker was a tool, a strong one, a dangerous one, a tool that could keep a wild town from falling apart. In the year 1878, Silver City decided it needed a town marshal, someone who would take control of the streets, the fights, and the endless trouble that rolled in with every wagon, train, or stick. The vote was not loud or proud. It was simple. The town wanted peace. Peace did not come from kind words in a place like Silver City. It came from a man like Dan Tucker. He became the first town marshal. From that moment, the town knew it had chosen someone different from any lawman they had known before. Silver City had seen sheriffs who talked big and shot little. It had seen gunmen who loved the sound of their own legends more than they loved justice. Dan Tucker was neither of those men. He walked the street with the same steady movements he had on his first day. Like every doorway might hide an enemy and every shadow might hold a gun. At night, mothers shut their windows and clung to their children. Outside, men argued in the saloons. Cards clacked on tables, boots scraped wood floors, and bottles cracked open. But something was changing. Most bars had rules now. Rules that grew from a single thought. Don Tucker is outside. Dan Tucker is listening. Dan Tucker will come. Some nights passed without a shot fired, and people said the town must be getting better. But trouble was part of the West. It did not care about rules or lawmen. It only needed one angry hand to push the whole town back into chaos. One evening, the sky burned orange as the sun slid down behind the hills. The town looked peaceful, but Silver City had learned that peace could break like glass. 3 men rode into town, dust on their hats and hate in their eyes. There were horse thieves, wanted across 2 counties, and they believed Silver City would be an easy place to drink and rest before disappearing into the mountains. They tied their horses outside a saloon and stepped through the doors like they owned the place inside. People moved out of their way. The 3 outlaws pushed to the bar, took whiskey without paying, and began laughing at their own crimes. One bragged that no lawman in New Mexico could stop them. Another boasted that he had outrun a sheriff's posse and shot 2 deputies in Texas. The third said nothing, but his hand never left the handle of his gun. It did not take long for word to reach the street. Someone ran to find Dan Tucker. Some believed he would wait for backup. Others believed he would watch first, plan, and strike when it was safest. But Dan Tucker was not a man who let poison sit in his town for long. He stepped through the doors of the saloon, and the room froze. He looked small next to the 3 outlaws, but size did not matter when death could sit in a man's hand. Tucker's voice was calm. "You boys are done here," he said. The tallest outlaw laughed and turned with his gun already lifting. He thought he was fast. He thought the stories about the marshal were only stories. He was wrong. Dan Tucker's revolver cleared leather first. 1 shot. The tall man fell back against the bar, whiskey spilling across the counter. The second man drew his pistol, but Dan fired again. That outlaw dropped beside the first, his hand still clutching the gun he never got to use. The third man tried to run, but Tucker's bullet struck his leg, and he crashed through a table before he could reach the door. The saloon filled with silence. There were no cheers, no applause. The people of Silver City knew better. They had seen enough death to know that every falling body carried a piece of the world with it. When the dead were taken out and the wounded outlaw was dragged to a cell, men gathered outside and spoke in low voices. Some said the marshal saved lives that day. Others said he should have tried to arrest the men alive. But in the end, the decision was simple. The three had come looking for trouble, and they had found Dan Tucker. His legend spread farther after that day. Stories traveled on stagecoaches over telegraph wires, and inside the pockets of cowboys moving from one dusty job to the next. People in other towns began to speak his name. Some said he was a hero. Some said he was a killer with a badge. But something else was growing inside Dan Tucker, something he did not speak of and did not let others see. He had begun to feel the weight of his own history settling over him like a dark cloak. Every life he ended, whether for justice or survival, left a mark. But he kept those marks hidden. The West did not reward men who showed their hearts. One night, Sheriff Whitehill sat with him in silence outside the jail. Lamps burned low. The night air smelled like dust and hot iron. "You do good work, Dan," the sheriff said. Tucker did not answer. "You keep this town standing," Whitehill added. "People sleep safer because of you." Don lifted his eyes. For a moment, the tough lines in his face softened. "Sheriff," he said, "people sleep, yes, but I don't." Whitehill said nothing more. He knew some burdens could not be lifted, not even by a friend. Still, Don Tucker kept walking those streets. He kept the peace. He kept the danger close so others could live another day. Silver City began to believe something that both comforted and frightened them. As long as Don Tucker was alive, no outlaw would ever truly rule their town. But the West was bigger than Silver City, and soon, new battles would call him away, where his skills, his gun, and his growing darkness would face their greatest tests. Danger does not rest in the West. Silver City had begun to settle under Dan Tucker's steady hand. But trouble in the frontier did not stay in one place for long. Word traveled fast. If a town had a man who could clean out the worst saloons and the wildest streets, other towns wanted that man too. That is how Dan Tucker found himself riding toward a place with a name that sounded like it belonged in a book. Not in the middle of New Mexico. The town was called Shakespeare. Shakespeare was small, dusty, and full of people who did not trust strangers. It was a mining town where fortunes changed overnight. One week a man could have gold dust overflowing from his pockets, and by the next week he could be stealing food or trying to rob a stagecoach. The ground gave treasure and took sanity. It was the kind of place where fights started over a look, a word, or a moment of bad luck. A few strong men had tried to become law in Shakespeare. None had stayed long. When Dan Tucker arrived, he brought only what he always had: his badge, his gun, and a silent promise that law would stand as long as he did. The first test came quickly. There was a man in Shakespeare named Jake Bond. Some said he was a rustler who stole horses from honest men and sold them across the border. Others said he was part of a gang that had killed 2 herders in cold blood. Rumor and truth mixed together like sand in the wind. But one thing was clear: Jake Bond had become a problem no one else wanted to solve. Don Tucker rode out to find him. The land outside Shakespeare was open and rough, full of rocks and thorny brush. A man could hide there for years. But Jake Bond made a mistake. He walked into a saloon one night, proud, loud, and certain that no one would ever try to put chains on him. Don walked in moments later. People backed away from the bar. Jake turned and stared at the marshal. His hand moved toward his gun, slow and sure. But Don Tucker had lived too long in a world where slow meant dead. His revolver lifted. One shot. Jake Bond fell to the wooden floor, the sound echoing through the saloon like thunder in the desert. That shot carried through the town. It sent a message. The law was not a joke in Shakespeare anymore. Soon after, Dan captured 2 more outlaws, men with dangerous reputations. One was Sandy King, known for shooting a man during a drunken argument. The other was a strange and dramatic character named Russian Bill Tattenbaum. Tattenbaum dressed in fancy clothes and spoke with an accent that turned heads. Some said he pretended to be a nobleman. Others said he had killed for sport. Whatever the truth, both King and Tattenbaum found themselves in a small cell, staring at Dan Tucker through iron bars. But Shakespeare was not like Silver City. The people did not trust courts or jails. They trusted rope and justice delivered in the dark. A vigilante group took the prisoners from their cells and hanged them without waiting for a trial. Their bodies were left hanging for a long time, long enough that people could see them and remember what happened to men who stole horses and spilled blood in Shakespeare. Dan Tucker did not stop the hanging. He did not praise it either. He simply watched the town and measured the fear and the calm that followed. His time in Shakespeare hardened his name even more. Stories began to move over the land like campfire smoke. Some were true, some were wild, except in some versions, Dan Tucker shot bullets out of another man's gun. In others, he rode straight into a gang's hideout and walked out alone. The truth was simpler but just as strong. Dan did not brag. He did not laugh in saloons or boast about body counts. He was a man who walked through danger as if he had been born inside it. Then came the call from Deming. Deming was a young town, full of railroad workers, ranch hands, gamblers, and men running from trouble in other states. It sat on land so flat that a rider could be seen from miles away. Outlaws loved it because they could strike fast and disappear into the desert before a posse could saddle up. The law there was thin, and the people of Deming were tired of losing their money, their livestock, and their brothers and sons. The county sent for Dan Tucker. He arrived with a shotgun in his hand and a badge pinned tight to his vest. People watched from windows, from doorways, from behind barrels and fences. They wondered if this man, small in size, could battle the violence that had taken hold of their lives. They did not wait long to find out. Within days, trouble showed itself. A group of men, known thieves and gunfighters, began harassing townsfolk. They fired pistols into the air and threatened a saloon owner. By the time Dan Tucker reached the scene, one man had already drawn on a stable boy. Tucker stepped into the street. His voice was calm and clear. "No guns in my town." The outlaws smiled at first. Then one of them raised his weapon. Dan fired the shotgun. The outlaw fell. The others scattered, trying to find cover or return fire. Tucker moved like a shadow. Another shot. A second man dropped. A third tried to escape on horseback, but Dan's bullet caught him before he reached the edge of town. When the shooting stopped, 3 men were dead and 2 were wounded. The rest left Deming before sunrise. People whispered the events for months. Some said Dan Tucker had saved the town. Others said the lawman was too quick to kill. But even those who doubted him could not deny a simple truth. Life in Deming changed after that night. Children played outside again. Merchants opened their doors without scanning the street for trouble. Train passengers stepped off the cars with less fear in their hearts. Don Tucker's name spread farther than ever. It reached Tucson, El Paso, and the ranches where cowhands sat around fires and traded stories about the fastest guns they had ever heard of. Some said Don was a hero. Some said he was half demon. But all agreed on one thing. Where Dan Tucker walked, the West grew quiet. But quiet does not last long on the frontier. And even as peace settled for a moment, new storms waited in the distance. Battles that would test Dan Tucker's mind. His badge and his soul were already forming in the dark. The West was not finished with him yet. For a long time, Don Tucker had been the answer to the problems of Silver City, Shakespeare, and Deming. When someone mentioned his name, men lowered their voices and women pulled their children a little closer. He was a shield, strong and steady, and his badge held back the wildness that lived in every corner of the West. But the West had a way of changing direction without warning. One day it could lift a man high, and the next it could drop him into darkness. The change began with a name everyone in the territory knew: James D. Burns. Burns was not an outlaw. He was a lawman too, respected and liked by many. He had worked as a deputy and a constable, and people said he had a good heart even when his temper ran hot. If someone needed help, Burns gave it. If trouble grew in the street, he stood in front of it. He was loud, brave, and sometimes reckless. But he was still considered a friend of the law. Dan Tucker and James Burns had worked near each other before. They were not close friends, but they understood the same world. A world where danger rode every road and justice was not always gentle. Yet one night, the paths of these two men crossed in a way that changed Dan Tucker's life forever. It happened in Silver City. The town was louder than usual. Payday had come, and miners were filling the saloons. Music and laughter cut through the air. Lamps glowed behind windows, and the sound of boots, cards, and glasses mixed like a storm of noise. In the middle of it all, James Burns had been drinking. Something had gone wrong inside him that night. No one knew if it was anger, heartbreak, or just whiskey. But the man who usually solved trouble had become the source of it. Burns walked the street with a pistol in his hand. He fired shots into the sky and shouted at anyone who tried to calm him. People ran for cover. Doors closed. Windows locked. A crowd gathered, whispering in fear. Burns had always been a proud man, but that night he was a man who had forgotten where the line was. Marshal G.W. Moore heard the noise first and hurried to stop Burns before someone got killed. Don Tucker went with him. They found Burns near a saloon, wild-eyed and ready to fight. Moore tried to take the gun from him, but Burns fought back. Tucker moved with quiet speed and struck Burns hard enough to knock the pistol from his hand. For a moment it seemed like the danger was over. Burns had been disarmed, and he could have walked away with some dignity. But the night was not finished. Moore told Tucker to stay with Burns while he went to get a warrant for arrest. Many believed that Burns only needed a calm moment, a place to sit, and time for the whiskey to leave his blood. But Burns was not the kind of man who could sit quietly after being forced to the ground in front of a crowd. Pride was burning inside him. When Moore returned, he carried the warrant and stepped into the saloon where Burns had taken shelter. The room went silent as people watched the strange scene unfold. Moore spoke clearly. "Burns, you are under arrest." Burns' eyes narrowed. His face changed. His hand dropped to the pistol he had taken back from somewhere inside the saloon. He lifted it, aimed, and the room exploded into motion. Dan Tucker did not wait. He drew his revolver and fired before Burns could pull the trigger. The bullet struck Burns in the ribs. The lamps shook from the blast. In the confusion, Moore and another officer also fired. Burns dropped to the floor, blood spreading across the boards. The room fell silent, except for the sound of his breath fading. The town changed in that silence. People rushed in. News spread in minutes. A respected lawman had died at the hands of another lawman. Some said Tucker had saved lives. Others said he had murdered a friend. The argument grew fast and angry. Soon, shouts filled the streets. They killed Burns for nothing. Burns was drunk and dangerous. Tucker is a hero. Tucker is a killer. The sheriff had no choice. Dan Tucker Moore and the other officer were arrested to prevent a lynching. They were moved secretly to another town, locked behind bars, and left to wait for a trial. It was the first time Tucker sat inside a cell. He did not speak much. Some said he stared at the wall as if the ghosts of the men he killed were standing in the stone. Others said he slept without fear, certain he had done what he needed to do. The trial lasted days. Witness after witness tried to explain what they saw. Some said Burns would have killed someone. Others said Tucker did not give him a chance. In the end, the court cleared Tucker of murder. The law said he had acted in the line of duty. But a ruling on paper cannot change a heart. Silver City did not welcome Dan Tucker the way it once had. Some shook his hand. Some turned away. Mothers pulled children inside when he walked by. The badge still rested on his vest, but it felt heavier than ever before. Don Tucker had never been a man who asked for praise, but now he carried something colder than pride. He carried doubt, not about what he had done, but about the world he lived in. A world where people wanted a lawman to be strong until they feared the strength they asked for. One evening, Tucker stood alone outside the jail, watching the sky burn red as the sun went down. A friend stepped up beside him and said, "You did what you had to do." Tucker kept his eyes on the horizon. "Maybe," he answered, "but every time a man dies, he takes a piece of the world with him. I have taken too many pieces." He walked away before the friend could reply. Silver City would survive, but the story of that night would follow Dan Tucker wherever he went. It would hang over him like desert heat, heavy and hard to escape. The West had begun to turn on him, and once the West turned, it rarely turned back. Soon a new danger would rise, one that carried Tucker far from Silver City, far from the places that once trusted him. His badge would take him into darker lands, where trains were robbed, posses formed, and death waited beside railroad tracks. The world was not done testing dangerous Dan Tucker. The next chapter of his life was already riding toward him, faster than any horse could run. Asterisk, the shooting of James Burns left a long shadow over Don Tucker's life. Some men in the West could kill a dozen outlaws and still be called heroes, but killing a lawman, even in the line of duty, brought a different kind of weight. Tucker felt it every time he walked down a street and saw a curtain move or a door close. Some friends stayed loyal. Many kept their distance. The badge was still on his chest, but the trust behind it was no longer whole. The West was changing. Railroads were cutting across the land like steel snakes. They carried freight, money, gold, and angry men with new dreams. Wherever money moved, outlaws followed. The railroad companies wanted men who could fight back, men with fast hands and faster decisions, men who did not freeze when danger came, men like Dan Tucker. So when the Southern Pacific Railroad needed a special officer, someone recommended Tucker. The company had heard the stories. They knew he was quick, deadly, and stubborn enough to chase trouble into the desert if needed. Tucker took the job. Some said he took it because he wanted a fresh start. Others said he took it because danger was the only thing that made sense to him anymore. He began riding trains, guarding shipments, watching tracks, and hunting bandits who thought they could outrun the law. The railroad did not care about gossip or politics. It cared about results, and Dan Tucker gave results. The most famous test of his railroad days began on a cold November night in 1883. A train was rolling through a lonely stretch of land near Gage Station. Between Deming and Lordsburg, the passengers were half asleep. The engineer was thinking about hot coffee in the next town. No one expected death to strike the rails. Then, without warning, the world shook. The train jumped the tracks. Cars smashed together. Steam burst into the air. Shouting filled the dark. Someone had pulled out the rails and prepared a robbery. The bandits rushed forward. They shot the engineer. They killed the express messenger. They tore open strong boxes and grabbed cash and gold. They vanished into the night before most passengers even understood what had happened. Messengers rode hard to find Don Tucker. He came fast, gathering a posse of men willing to chase killers through territory filled with danger. The land between Gage Station and the mountains was open and harsh. A man could die from thirst or find himself staring down Apache warriors who did not care whether he wore a badge or not. Tucker studied the ground, checked tracks, and followed every sign the bandits left behind. He rode at the front of the posse, silent as always, eyes sharp as a blade. Some men in the posse had heard the stories about him. They watched him carefully, wondering if everything they heard was true. They discovered one thing quickly. Dan Tucker did not waste time. Day after day the posse rode. Some nights they slept in the dirt, eyes open, guns closed. Other nights they thought about turning back. The robbers were dangerous. They had already killed 2 men and would kill more if cornered. But Tucker pushed on. He did not shout at his men or promise glory. He simply kept going. And because he kept going, they followed. Then stories people told later. They said Tucker hunted the robbers for almost a week. When the posse finally caught up to them near a line of rocky hills, a gunfight exploded in the dark. Tucker fired first. Horses reared. Bullets sparked off stone. One outlaw fell. Another was wounded. The rest scattered. The posse chased them until the sun rose. When it was over, the gang was broken and the trail of violence ended. The railroad praised Tucker. People said he had avenged the engineer and the express messenger, but that was not the last fight he would face on the rails. Another killer named York Kelly crossed Dan Tucker's path not long after. Kelly had robbed a bank and killed 3 people, including a woman carrying a child. The crime turned cold fear into hot anger among ranchers and lawmen. Tucker tracked Kelly and arrested him. It was not easy. Kelly was known for fighting like a cornered wolf, but the badge did not shake on Tucker's vest. And once again he brought his man in. By 1885, Tucker had become a deputy United States Marshal for the region. That meant he did not only protect trains, he protected the land around them. One story tells of Tucker and his friend William Graham riding west when a group of Apache warriors attacked. The desert turned into a battlefield. The warriors fired from behind rocks and brush. Tucker and Graham fought back, firing until the attack ended. The 2 lawmen survived, but the memory stayed with Tucker. The West was not only gunfighters and thieves. It was a land where every group fought to survive in its own way. He understood that better with every ride. Even with his success, people still remembered the death of James Burns. That story followed him into every new town. It made some people glance away when he passed by. It made others stare longer, as if trying to decide whether he was a hero or a curse. Tucker never explained himself. He never defended his name. He lived by a simple line: do the job, protect the people, to survive the day. But deep inside, the weight grew heavier. There were nights when a campfire burned low and the stars hung like cold coins in the sky. On those nights, Tucker sometimes sat alone. Men who rode with him said they saw a different look in his eyes. Not fear, not doubt. Something quieter. Something that felt like a man trying to carry more memories than one life could hold. He had buried many moments in his mind. The man in the dance hall. The drunk with the stone. The horse thieves in the saloon. Jake Bond in Shakespeare. Sandy King in Russian Bill. The bodies hanging from ropes. The gun smoke in Deming. James Burns dying on a saloon floor. The train derailment. The engineer who never went home. The Apache battle in the desert. The outlaws he had shot or captured. The endless dust. The endless gunfire. Dan Tucker had become a legend, but legends do not always sleep in peace. He kept riding. He kept fighting. But history has a way of closing in on even the strongest men. The next road would take him toward California, toward the last chapter of his story, and toward a silence that even the toughest lawman could not outrun. Dan Tucker had ridden through more danger than most men could imagine. He had faced gunmen, rustlers, train robbers, and Apache warriors. He had walked into saloons where death sat at the same table as whiskey. He had been praised as a protector and cursed as a killer. But no matter how long a man survives the West, there comes a time when the gun grows heavy and the road grows long. After years of chasing outlaws for the Southern Pacific Railroad and the United States Marshal Service, Dan's body reminded him that he was still flesh and bone. One gunfight in a brothel in Deming left him wounded, and though he lived, the pain stayed with him. It made riding stagecoaches harder. It made sleeping under the stars uncomfortable. It reminded him that even the fastest hand would one day slow. Dan Tucker was never a man who feared death, but he knew enough to respect it. He had seen too many last breaths, heard too many dying men whisper names of wives, mothers, or children they would never see again. He had watched strong horses fall and had felt the hand of a dying outlaw clutch his coat, so when his body began to ache, he listened. It was time to think about a different life. He moved to California. Some said he went there because the land was quieter. Others said he went because it was a place where fewer people knew his name. A few believed he was looking for peace that he had never found in the desert towns of New Mexico. Whatever his reason, the road carried him west, away from the railroad tracks, away from old gunfights, and away from the towns that still spoke his name in whispers. California in those days was changing fast. There were farms, ranches, orchards, and growing towns filled with people who wanted a new start. For the first time in years, Dan Tucker walked through streets where no one stepped aside, and no one stared at the gun on his hip. He could sit in a cafe and eat a meal without watching the door every second. The silence felt strange, like a man who had slept beside thunder trying to rest in soft rain. Some said he worked on ranches. Others said he tried prospecting. A few claimed he became a guard for a shipping company. But the truth of those years is unclear. Dan Tucker did not leave letters or diaries behind. He did not try to write his side of history. He lived quietly, as if trying to fold himself into the world rather than stand apart from it. But the past is a long shadow, and shadows follow even the strongest riders. In 1892, Dan Tucker returned to New Mexico for a short time. People who saw him said he had changed. He had grown heavier, slower, and older. He did not move like a panther anymore. The scars on his body were not fresh, but they still spoke of the life he had lived. The eyes that once watched every rooftop and alleyway now looked farther away, as if staring into a field only he could see. Some men shook his hand and welcomed him back. Others avoided him, still remembering the night James Burns died. A few young lawmen who had only heard stories looked at him with awe, wanting to ask questions but unsure how to speak to a legend. Dan did not stay long. He visited a few places, shared a drink with a few friends, and then left once more. For many it was the last time they ever saw him. After that, Dan Tucker faded like smoke in the wind. Stories spread. Some said he went back to California and lived near San Bernardino. Others said he drifted north and worked small jobs until his body could not handle the labor. A rumor claimed he died in a hospital, alone, with no badge, no gun, and no one to speak his name at the end. But no proof was ever found. No grave with his full name. No stone that read, "Dangerous Dan Tucker." It was as if the land swallowed him, keeping his final secret for itself. Men who had ridden with him tried to tell his tale, but memories change. Some described him as a hero who saved innocent lives. Others said he was a storm that brought justice, but also fear. And some, especially the families of men who died by his gun, spoke of him as a cold killer who hid behind a badge. The truth was likely a mix of all three. Time changed the West. Railroads grew longer. Towns built schools and churches. Children played where gunfighters once stood ready to shoot. The world that had shaped Dan Tucker began to disappear. People moved on, and new stories filled their lives. His name settled into old books, forgotten newspapers, and the minds of a few aging cowboys who had seen him draw faster than any other man. Yet, even though history tried to bury him, the legend of Dan Tucker survived in small fires. A researcher would find his name in dusty court papers. A writer would find a newspaper clipping about the night he shot 3 horse thieves. A rancher would repeat a story told by his grandfather about the time Tucker cleaned the streets of Deming. A historian would argue that he should be remembered as one of the deadliest and most effective lawmen in the American West. Perhaps the reason he was forgotten was simple. Don Tucker never wanted fame. He took no pride in killing. He never posed for dime novels or performed in Wild West shows. He never sold his story to a newspaper. He carried his legend the way he carried his gun, quietly, with purpose, and without celebration. In the end, the question remains, was Dan Tucker a hero, a villain, or just a man doing whatever the world forced him to do? Was he dangerous because he chose to be, or because the frontier left him no other way to survive? The answers may never be known, but the legend still rides through memory. A quiet lawman who walked into the worst towns of the West and stood between chaos and order. Somewhere under the wide skies of the frontier, there may be an unmarked grave where Dan Tucker rests, or maybe he went farther than anyone guessed, leaving the West behind forever. Only one thing is certain. When people speak of the Wild West, and they speak of men with nerves of iron and guns that answered faster than words, someone, somewhere, will whisper his name. Dangerous Dan Tucker. When a man spends most of his life with danger as a companion, it becomes hard for him to understand a world without it. That is what happened to Dan Tucker. For years he had lived in places where life could change with the pull of a trigger. He had eaten meals with his back to the wall. He had slept with one hand on his gun. Silence had never meant peace for him. It meant waiting. But time did what bullets could not. It changed the West. Railroads spread farther. Towns grew. Judges replaced rope justice. New laws made the old ways look rough and wild. Men who once lived by their guns now worked in shops or on farms. Children walked streets where outlaws once stood. The frontier was not as hungry for blood as it had been. A man like Dan Tucker, once needed, now stood at the edges of a world that no longer understood him. In California the days were calmer. Some mornings Dan woke and did not hear gunshots or the sound of horses running hard down a dirt road. He heard roosters, wagons, and sometimes children laughing in the distance. He watched those children play and wondered what it would have been like to grow up without fear behind every corner. He never spoke those thoughts aloud. They stayed locked inside him like so many other pieces of his life. He tried ranch work for a time. The work was honest, and the land was wide. But work that should have been simple was made harder by the pain that still lived in his shoulder and back. He did not complain. Complaining was not his way. Still, some days he stopped in the middle of loading a wagon or tying a fence because his body reminded him of every shot, every fall, every long night in the desert. One rancher said later that Dan Tucker worked like a man who had nothing left to run from, but also nothing left to chase. He was quiet, distant, like a horse that had been ridden hard for too many years and was finally allowed to stand still. People respected him, even if they did not know why. Sometimes a stranger would come through town and notice the way Tucker carried himself. A traveler might look twice and whisper to a friend, believing he had seen a man from the old stories. A saloon keeper might ask if he had once been a lawman. Tucker would answer only what he needed to. He did not hide his name, but he did not offer it easily. A few old-timers knew him and would nod when he walked by. Most people simply saw an aging man who carried himself like someone who had seen 100 storms at night. He would sit outside, staring at the dark hills. He did not drink much. Whiskey clouded the mind, and his mind had kept him alive too many times for him to let it go dull. He would breathe slowly, letting the cool night air settle his thoughts. Sometimes he would remember faces. Some were men he had arrested. Some were men he had killed. Some were men he had worked beside. Some memories were sharp. Others faded like distant campfire smoke. There were names he never forgot: Burns, Bond, King, Russian, Bill, Kelly, men who had shaped his life as much as any friend ever had. He did not say their names aloud, but the memories stayed with him like dust on old boots. Years passed. Tucker grew older. His hair lost its color. His eyes carried lines from long days under the desert sun. Much of his life had been written in newspapers, told in saloons, and passed between cowboys and railroad men. But now, in California, the stories changed. Time smoothed the sharp edges. People told tales of him like a legend, a ghost from the frontier. Some stories said he could shoot a man before the man even touched his gun. Some said he walked straight into a patchy fire and came out without a scratch. Others said he rode alone into Deming and cleared the streets in a single night. None of these stories were exactly right, and none of them were completely wrong. Like most legends, the truth lived somewhere in between. Then, one year, the stories began to quiet. Fewer people spoke his name. New heroes and new villains filled the newspapers. The world moved forward. Dan Tucker, once the man whose presence could silence a saloon, now stepped into stores and walked out without a single person knowing who he had been. There are reports, though not proven, that he spent time near San Bernardino. Some say he worked small jobs, saved his money, and kept to himself. Rumors whisper that he grew sick and was taken to a hospital. But no record was found. No death certificate. No known grave. It was as if he stepped into the same silence he had carried his whole life and simply kept walking. Men like Dan Tucker were not made for endings with monuments and famous last words. He was a man shaped by the rough edge of the frontier. When the frontier disappeared, he slipped away with it. Years later, historians searched for him. They looked through records, papers, and stories passed down by families. They found pieces of his trail, but never the end. The West had kept it secret. The last chapter of Dangerous Dan Tucker remained unwritten. Still, when old cowboys sat by firelight and talked about the West before fences, before electric lights, before the law was written in thick books rather than drawn from a leather holster, one name came back from the dust: Don Tucker, a quiet man, a deadly man, a lawman who did not ask who watched him, who praised him, or who cursed him. He did what he believed the frontier demanded. And when that frontier died, he did what he always did. He moved on, into silence, leaving behind only stories and the wind that still whispers his name. The last years of Dan Tucker's life were wrapped in quiet roads and half-remembered trails. He had lived through gunsmoke and broken saloons. He had ridden through desert heat and freezing nights, hunted killers, chased robbers, and buried too many memories. Now the world that once needed a man like him had changed, and the danger that shaped him had begun to fade like a dying campfire. But legends do not disappear so easily. They leave marks, even when the man behind them tries to walk away. The story of Dangerous Dan Tucker still traveled, carried by men who had seen what he could do or had only heard the echo of his name in counties far from New Mexico. Some remembered him as a lawman who saved lives. Some remembered him as a killer with a badge. The truth sat somewhere between those two thoughts. Like a shadow lying between sun and stone in California, Don Tucker moved like a man who wished to be ordinary. He found work when his body could manage it. Some said he worked as a ranch hand. Others told that he labored in fields or carried freight for small businesses. He did not speak about his past, and most people did not ask. In a growing state full of newcomers, everyone had come from somewhere, and not all pasts were worth stirring. He stayed in one place for a while, then drifted again, some towns near San Bernardino, some farther north. A few claimed to have seen him near the rail lines, watching the engines pass with the same focus he once carried as a railroad guard. When the trains screamed across the land, steam pouring into the air, he sometimes stood still and listened. The wind carried the metal song, and he remembered the long rides when robbery could strike at any moment. Worse, he remembered the ones who never walked away from those nights. There were times when his name reached him again, like a voice from a world he thought he had left behind. A rancher might ride through town and stare at him, eyebrows raised as if trying to place a memory. A retired sheriff might shake his head slowly and say, "You remind me of a man I once knew in New Mexico." Tucker would nod and say little. If the man pushed for details, Tucker changed the subject. The past was a canyon he refused to walk back into, yet late at night, when the wind blew across empty ground, he could not stop his thoughts from wandering. He would sit outside, one hand around a tin cup, his revolver resting close even when he tried not to notice it. The stars above him were the same stars that had watched over countless gunfights, chases, and narrow escapes. The sky did not forget, even if men did. He thought about the ones he had killed. He did not count them, but he remembered their faces, or at least pieces of them. A hand grabbing for a gun, a voice shouting, a shadow stepping out from behind a wagon. He remembered their final moments, how fast life could leave a body. He wondered, in those quiet nights, whether any of those men had families who still waited for answers that never came. Some memories were sharper than others. He remembered the death of James Burns, the lawman whose passing divided Silver City. That moment had clung to him like a burr for years. There were days when he told himself he had done what was necessary. There were nights when he wondered if he had fired too quickly. The West had been a hard place, and a man learned to act before someone else did. But time allowed questions that survival once silenced. As years passed, his body grew slower. His hands, once steady as iron, began to shake. His breath came shorter when he climbed hills. When he woke, the old pains from bullets and falls were waiting, as loyal as they had always been. He could no longer ride long distances. He walked instead, his boots wearing down on the dusty paths of towns that barely remembered him. People talked. They wondered who the quiet older man was. They called him Mr. Tucker or simply Dan. Sometimes someone would ask about the scar on his shoulder or the way he kept his back to a wall when he sat indoors. He always answered with as few words as possible. He had learned long ago that stories were fuel for trouble. Once, a younger man bragged loudly in a saloon and claimed to be the fastest shot in the county. He laughed at Dan's age and said that older men should leave gun talk to younger ones. The room grew still. Don finished his coffee, stood up, and walked to the door without looking back. He did not need to prove anything anymore. The younger man never knew how close he had been to learning a hard lesson. There were men who respected him, even without knowing who he was. They respected the way he watched over the room when he entered it. They respected the way he stepped between others when a fight began, stopping trouble with a single command. Age had softened his body but sharpened his presence. He carried calm like other men carried weapons. But the years kept taking. The frontier world, once wide and wild, shrank and changed. Laws grew stricter, towns grew bigger, stagecoaches gave way to faster trains, and trains gave way to automobiles. Don Tucker became a man from another lifetime. One winter, someone claimed he had been taken to a hospital. Another man swore he saw Tucker bury someone close to him. A third said he walked into the desert one evening and never returned. No record proved any of those stories. The truth dissolved into dust. Eventually, history stopped looking for him. The world moved on, but some old cowboys, sitting near dying campfires, still spoke about him. They said that when the West needed a man with iron nerves and a steady trigger, Dan Tucker had stepped forward. And when the West no longer needed such men, he stepped away. No one knows where he died. No one knows where he is buried. Maybe under a tree, maybe near a river, maybe in a desert valley where the wind keeps secrets. But if a traveler rides through quiet land and hears the dry grass move, he might feel something watching. A memory, a name, a lawman who walked out of the smoke and never came back. Dangerous Dan Tucker, the man who became a whisper in the wind. Years passed, and the world kept moving forward, leaving behind the men who once held the frontier together with a badge and a steady gun hand. Dan Tucker was gone, though where his trail ended remained a mystery. Some said he died in California. Others believed he rode south and lived his final days under a different name. A few old-timers swore they saw him long after most people assumed he had passed. But time has a way of covering truth with dust. Still, the legend of Dangerous Dan Tucker did not die. It changed. It shifted shape. It turned into stories passed between ranch hands at night and railroad men riding long stretches of track. His name became a test. If a man had heard of Tucker, he was counted among those who knew the true West, the West of broken towns and hard law. If he had not, older men only shook their heads. In New Mexico, some counties still whispered about the nights when he walked the streets of Silver City and trouble disappeared. They remembered how a drunken man with a handful of stones became a threat, and Tucker ended it before anyone else could get hurt. They remembered the dance hall in Johnny Ward's place, where a knife fight turned bloody and Dan did not hesitate. He did not wait for a murderer to escape into the darkness. One shot changed everything, and no one forgot it. In Shakespeare they spoke of Jake Bond, the rustler who thought no lawman would dare face him. But Dan Tucker did. They repeated the story of Sandy King and Russian Bill, captured and later hanged by vigilantes. Some said that Tucker never ordered the hanging, but he also did nothing to stop it. The West did not always leave room for courts and proper trials. It demanded quick answers. Men decided whether those answers were fair long after the ropes tightened. Then there was Deming, where his name still carried weight, even decades later. People told how he arrived with a shotgun and cleared the town in days. 3 dead, 2 wounded, the rest gone before the next sunrise. Some said the streets had never been safer. Others said they had never been more afraid. But fear and safety sometimes walk the same path. And Dan Tucker had walked it longer than most. The part of his story that divided people the most was always the death of James Burns. For some, it was proof that Tucker was too fast to fire. For others, it was proof that he acted when he had no choice. Burns had been drunk and dangerous, waving a gun and shooting into the air. Tucker and Marshall Moore tried to stop him. The shots that followed still echoed through history. Even when the court cleared Tucker, the argument never ended. Historians started looking into his life years later. One writer called him one of the most underrated lawmen in the West. Another suggested that many famous gunfighters survived on talk and reputation, while Tucker survived on skill and experience. He had no interest in fame. He left no letters, few photographs, and no autobiography to shape his image. Because of that, others shaped it for him. Books began to mention his name. Not every book, not every history. He was not Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok, names polished by newspapers and Wild West shows. He was not Buffalo Bill Cody, who turned his own legend into a business. Tucker had been something different, something the West understood but did not always celebrate. He was the kind of man who held back chaos but did not ask to be thanked for it. Even long after he disappeared, people wondered what kind of man he really was. Was he a hero or a killer? Was he a man who protected innocent lives or a man who lost himself inside a world of violence? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was neither. The West was not polite enough to give clear answers. A few men who lived long enough to see the new century said that Tucker represented something the modern world could not understand. He came from a time when the law did not arrive by telephone or telegram. It arrived on horseback, through dust and heat, often alone. A time when a badge did not promise safety. It promised responsibility. It promised that some nights would end with a man burying another and riding home with silence sitting heavy in his chest. Sometimes, around a fire, old men would say that people judge too quickly when they forget what the frontier demanded. They would tell younger listeners to imagine a time with no electricity, no fast help, no doctors nearby, no safe courtrooms. A time when a single mistake meant losing a town to outlaws. In that world, Dan Tucker did what he believed he had to do. The younger men asked the same question every time. Was he good or bad? The older men would shrug. He was necessary. They answered. There might be no finer truth about him. As the years faded and the frontier turned into highways and cities, fewer people remembered Dan Tucker, but in small libraries, in ranch houses, in railroad stories passed to new workers, his name survived. A quiet figure, a cautious man, a dangerous man when he needed to be. If a stranger rides across the New Mexico desert today and stops to listen, he may hear only wind. But there are places where that wind moves differently, where it seems to carry footsteps from another age. And in that lonely sound, if a person listens close enough, a name rises like dust from an old trail. Dangerous Dan Tucker, a man almost forgotten, a man still worth remembering because some stories were never meant to end. The West is not a place on a map. It is a memory in the land, a story in the wind, and a voice that never stops calling. Long after the mountains were mapped, long after the railroad tracks cut across the plains, long after the gunfighters laid down their weapons, the frontier lived on in stories. And in those stories, named Dangerous Dan Tucker still appeared like a shadow crossing a desert road that no one knew when his life ended. No one knew where he took his last breath. But the last chapter of a story is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is written in the people who keep the story alive, in the ranchers who first told it, in the railroad workers who repeated it, in the historians who tried to find the truth behind it, and in anyone who hears his name and imagines a man riding alone into a dangerous town, choosing duty over comfort, law over silence. In his final years, Don Tucker had walked slowly, worked modestly, and spoken little, but his silence did not erase what he had done. The frontier remembered. The people whose lives he protected remembered. Even the families of men he killed in the line of duty passed down stories of a lawman who fired without hesitation. Some stories were filled with anger, others were filled with respect, all were filled with certainty that he had changed the world around him. There was a time, people said, when an old man sat beside a small campfire on the edge of a California orchard. He did not speak to anyone. He simply watched the flames and held something in his hands, something wrapped in cloth. A young boy from the ranch approached and asked what it was. The old man slowly removed the cloth and showed him a worn, well-oiled revolver. Was it yours? The boy asked. The old man nodded. Did you use it? The boy asked next. The old man was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees. Finally, he said, I used it to keep the world standing. The boy never forgot that sentence. Years later, he wondered if the quiet man by the fire had been Dan Tucker. He could never prove it, but the memory remained like a bright ember. Men who lived through the frontier era said that the world lost something when the West was tamed. Not the violence, not the fear, but the sense that courage could change everything. A single man, standing tall, could hold back danger long enough for families to build towns, schools, and futures. Dan Tucker had been one of those men. Was he perfect? No. Was he gentle? No. But the world he lived in was neither perfect nor gentle. It required hard choices. It required men who were willing to take the weight others could not carry. A badge is a simple thing made of metal, but sometimes it becomes heavier than iron. Tucker carried that weight longer than most men could have. What happened to him in his last days remained a mystery. Some believed he died in a boarding house near San Bernardino. Others believed he moved farther north and was buried in an unmarked grave beside a river. A few stories said he rode into the desert one last time because he did not want the world to see him grow weak. Whatever the truth, his story did not end with his death. It waited in books, in archives, and in the fading recollections of old. Men who once watched him walk down a street where fear stopped moving. Historians would later learn his name again. Writers would tell his story. Teachers would include him in lessons about the American frontier. And listeners would sit amazed at the idea that someone so important could be forgotten for so long. In the end, the question remained: who was dangerous? Dan Tucker, a hero, a killer, a lawman, a survivor maybe. He was all these things. Maybe the West needed men like him in ways that are difficult to understand today. The world is different now, but the lessons remain. Courage matters, duty matters, standing your ground matters, even when no one thanks you for it. And so, the legend did not end in silence. It continued, carried like a spark from one generation to the next. If you ever travel through New Mexico, or stand in the quiet streets of Silver City at dusk, you might feel something in the air. A memory, a presence, the echo of bootsteps on wooden boards, the soft weight of eyes watching the world with caution. And if the wind rises, moving dust across the old mining roads, some say you might hear a name spoken by the land itself. Don Tucker. Not the fastest gun of the West, not the most famous, just the one who refused to step aside when danger tried to take control. The one who did what he believed was right, even when the world around him was too wild to agree. When the frontier needed a shield, Don Tucker stood in the doorway. When the railroad needed protection, he rode the tracks. When a town was drowning in lawlessness, he walked straight into the center of it. He was not a perfect man, but he was a necessary one. And now if anyone should ask why his story still matters, the answer is simple. Because somewhere out there, in every place where people struggle between fear and courage, there is still a part of the world that needs a man like Dan Tucker. The frontier may be gone, but the spirit of those who tamed it still burns. In the end, that is all a legend is. A fire that never fully goes out. Dangerous Dan Tucker, lawman, survivor, legend.